The farm had been in George Miller's family for 3 generations. It wasn't much. A modest house, a barn with a sagging roof, and a few acres of fields bordered by thick woods. But it was his. George had spent most of his 65 years working the land, raising livestock and keeping to himself. He didn't need much beyond the peace and solitude that came with life on the outskirts of nowhere. The days were simple, predictable, and lonely. George liked it that way. But one autumn, as the leaves turned gold and the nights grew colder, something changed. The unfamiliar noise. It began with the sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping that came late at night, echoing faintly from the direction of the barn. At first, George dismissed it. Old wood groans in the wind, he told himself. But as the nights passed, the noise grew louder, more deliberate. It didn't sound like the wind anymore. On the 5th night, unable to ignore it, George decided to investigate. The moon hung low, casting the farm in a pale glow. Clutching a lantern in one hand and his rifle in the other, he made his way to the barn. The air was sharp and cold, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. Inside the barn, all was still. The cattle in the stalls shifted uneasily, their breath visible in the cold air. George moved the lantern's light across the hay-strewn floor, the shadows dancing against the walls. Nothing seemed out of place. He was about to turn back when a sudden chill ran down his spine. Behind him, something scraped against the barn door. Slowly, George turned, raising the lantern. The door was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Beyond it lay only darkness. The missing calf. The next morning, George's unease deepened. One of his calves was missing. The gate to the pen was unlatched, swinging idly in the breeze. At first, he thought the calf might have wandered off, but a search of the surrounding fields turned up nothing. He found tracks leading into the woods, deep prints that didn't look like they came from any animal he recognized. They were long and narrow, with claw-like imprints at the tips. His unease grew, but he convinced himself it was just a large predator, maybe a coyote or even a bear. Determined to keep his livestock safe, George spent the rest of the day reinforcing the pens and setting up an old hunting camera he'd used years ago. If something was stalking his farm, he'd catch it. The visitor. The following night, the thumping returned, louder and closer than before. George sat in his kitchen, the rifle resting on the table beside him. His heart pounded with every sound, but he stayed inside. Whatever it was, he'd let it come to him. At 2:17 a.m., the motion sensor light on the barn flickered on. George bolted upright, grabbing his rifle. He peeked out the window, scanning the yard. At first, he saw nothing, just the barn illuminated under the pale light. But then, something moved. A shadow passed across the side of the barn. It was tall, far taller than any man, and its shape was wrong, lanky and twisted with unnaturally long limbs. George blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him, but when he looked again, the shadow was gone. The motion light clicked off, plunging the yard back into darkness. The camera. The next morning, George retrieved the hunting camera, his hands trembling slightly as he scrolled through the images. Most were unremarkable, empty shots of the barn and surrounding fields. But then he froze. One image showed a figure standing at the edge of the camera's range, its features blurred but unmistakably unnatural. Its arms were long and thin, almost dragging on the ground, and its head was cocked at an odd angle. The thing seemed to be staring directly at the camera, its eyes faintly glowing in the night. George's stomach churned. He didn't know what he was looking at, but he knew it wasn't something that belonged in the woods, or anywhere else. The night attack. That night, George didn't sleep. He sat by the window, the rifle in his lap, waiting. The hours dragged by, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old house settling. Then, just after midnight, he heard it, a low, guttural growl so faint he wasn't sure if he imagined it. But the cattle heard it too. They began to bellow and stomp in their stalls. George sprang to his feet and ran outside, the cold air biting at his face. He aimed the rifle at the barn, scanning for movement. The growl came again, louder this time, and then something moved in the shadows near the tree line. The creature stepped into the moonlight, and George's breath caught in his throat. It was like the thing in the photo, but worse. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its face was a featureless mask, save for two dark, sunken eyes. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, its limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. George fired. The shot echoed across the farm, and the creature let out an ear-piercing screech before disappearing back into the woods. The cattle calmed, and the night grew silent once more, but George knew it wasn't over. The lair. The next day, George followed the tracks into the woods. They led him deeper than he'd ever ventured, past familiar landmarks and into a part of the forest that felt wrong. The trees here were gnarled and twisted, their branches forming claw-like shapes that seemed to reach for him. At last, he came to a clearing. In the center stood a massive oak, its roots sprawling like the legs of some great beast. At the base of the tree was a hole, wide and dark, leading underground. George hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't, not when he knew this was where the thing had come from. The final confrontation, the tunnel beneath the tree was narrow and damp, the air thick with the smell of rot. George held his rifle tightly, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. He didn't have to go far before he found it. The creature was crouched in a corner, its back to him. Surrounding it were the remains of animals, bones scattered haphazardly, the air heavy with decay. The thing turned slowly, its eyes catching the light. It lunged. George fired, the shot tearing through the confined space. The creature shrieked, flailing wildly as it collapsed. George fired again and again, until the thing stopped moving. The aftermath. George emerged from the woods just as dawn broke, his face pale and his hands shaking. He didn't bother to explain to anyone what had happened. No one would believe him. The remains of the creature stayed where they were, deep in the forest, and George avoided that part of the woods for the rest of his days. The farm returned to its quiet existence, but George was never the same. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the barn, sent his heart racing. He kept the rifle by his side at all times, just in case, because some nights when the wind was still, he swore he could hear it again, the faint, rhythmic thumping of something that refused to stay dead. Samuel Turner was a solitary man, content with the quiet life he led on his farm. He had inherited the sprawling property from his father, who had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving Samuel to manage the land by himself. The farm was isolated, tucked away in the rolling hills of northern Arkansas, far from the nearest neighbor. His closest contact with the outside world came from trips into town every few weeks to restock supplies. The farm itself was modest but steady. Samuel grew corn, raised cattle, and kept a small flock of chickens. His days followed a rhythm, from tending to the crops in the early morning to milking the cows in the evening. The work was hard, but Samuel found peace in the routine, in the simple life his father had taught him to cherish. But as time passed, things on the farm began to change. The first night, it all began on a cold autumn evening. Samuel had just finished his chores and was sitting on the porch of the old farmhouse, sipping on a cup of black coffee. The night was calm, with only the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. He glanced toward the barn, his eyes scanning the darkness. It was odd. He couldn't see the usual shadows of his cattle moving in the barn. Curious, Samuel set his cup down and walked toward the barn, the crunch of his boots the only sound breaking the silence. When he opened the barn door, he was met with an eerie stillness. The cows were gone, the stables were empty, save for a few broken fence posts scattered across the floor. His heart raced as he quickly checked the pens outside, but there was no sign of his cattle. Confused and irritated, Samuel began to search the surrounding fields. It didn't make sense. There was no way they could have escaped. The fences were sturdy and there were no signs of a break-in. After hours of searching, he found nothing. His cattle had simply vanished. Frustrated, he went back to the house, locking the door behind him. As he sat by the fire, the strange events from earlier gnawed at him. He had lived on this farm for years, and nothing like this had ever happened before. The strange markings. The next morning, Samuel set out to investigate the area around his farm more thoroughly. As he walked through the woods behind his property, he came across something strange. There were large, deep marks in the earth, as if something had been dragged through the forest. The dirt was torn up, and large, claw-like indentations marked the path. Samuel's heart skipped a beat as he crouched down to inspect the tracks. They were unlike anything he had ever seen before. The The shape of the marks was more akin to human feet than animal prints, but they were much too large. There was a strange pattern to them, as if whatever had made them had been dragging its body along the ground. He followed the marks deeper into the woods, his breath quickening with each step. The tracks led him to a small clearing, where he found more disturbing signs. Torn branches and shredded leaves scattered on the ground, as if something had been thrashing through the trees. But there were no signs of the cattle. As he stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, a distant howl echoed through the trees. The sound was deep and guttural, unlike anything Samuel had ever heard before. It made his blood run cold. The disappearing livestock. Over the next few days, the strange events escalated. Samuel's livestock began to disappear, first the cows, then the chickens, and even the sheep. Every morning, he would find the pens empty, the gates secure as though no one had touched them. But when he checked the fields, there were no signs of the animals. No tracks, no feathers, no blood, just the eerie silence. The only thing that remained were the strange, deep claw marks in the earth, always leading toward the woods. It was as if something was taking his animals, and whatever it was not leaving any trace of them behind. Samuel became paranoid. He stopped sleeping at night, keeping his eyes fixed on the woods. He would sit in the farmhouse, rifle in hand, staring into the blackness. The howls continued, growing louder each night, but every time he ventured into the woods, he found nothing. His nerves were frayed. He was a man of the land, used to hard work and long hours. But this was something he couldn't understand, something that gnawed at his very soul. The midnight visitor. One night, as Samuel sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames, he heard a noise, a soft scraping sound coming from outside. His heart raced as he stood up and grabbed his rifle. The wind was still, and the house was eerily quiet. He opened the door, stepping out onto the porch. The air was thick with tension, and as he looked toward the barn, he saw something moving in the shadows. It was too large to be an animal, too tall to be a man. The figure was hunched over, its silhouette barely visible against the dark sky. Samuel's pulse quickened as he raised his rifle. He called out into the night, but the figure didn't respond. It simply stood there, unmoving. Slowly, Samuel crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The creature didn't make a sound, but Samuel could feel its eyes on him. Suddenly, the creature moved, faster than any human or animal could. It lunged at him, and Samuel barely had time to fire his rifle. The shot missed, and the creature was upon him in an instant, its sharp claws scraping against the ground as it rushed toward him. He pulled the trigger again, and this time the shot hit its mark. The creature let out a screech, a sound that sent a shiver down Samuel's spine. It staggered backward, but it didn't fall. Instead, it straightened up, its face coming into view for the first time. What Samuel saw nearly made him faint. The creature had a humanoid shape, but its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were black, reflecting the dim light from the lantern hanging on the porch. Its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, with rows of sharp, jagged teeth that looked like they belonged to some kind of predator. Samuel stumbled backward, his mind racing. He fired again, this time hitting the creature square in the chest. It let out another deafening screech, but it still didn't fall. The creature seemed almost invincible. With a last, desperate effort, Samuel raised the rifle one final time and fired. This time, the creature crumpled to the ground, motionless. Samuel stood over the body, panting, his heart racing in his chest. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was alive or if this had all been some nightmare. But when he looked down at the creature's body, he knew it was real. Whatever it was, it had been hunting him, and it had nearly killed him. The end of the harvest. The following days were filled with dread. Samuel buried the creature in a shallow grave near the edge of the woods, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something still lurked out there. He didn't trust the land anymore. The silence had returned, but it wasn't peaceful. It was an unsettling quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. For the first time in his life, Samuel packed up and left the farm. He couldn't stay there any longer, not with the memories of what he had seen, not with the knowledge that something had been hunting him from the woods. The farm stood empty for years after that, the land untouched and the house slowly decaying. Samuel never spoke of what happened to anyone, and no one ever came looking for him. But sometimes, late at night, people passing by would hear the faint sound of a howl drifting on the wind, deep and mournful, like the call of something that had never truly left. Farmer Amos lived alone on his small piece of land, tucked away miles from the nearest town. Black Hollow Farm wasn't much, just a weathered house, a leaning barn, and a few dozen acres of crops and pasture. Amos liked it that way. He didn't care for noise or neighbours. He rose with the sun, worked hard, and went to bed when the stars filled the sky. His life was simple, predictable, until it wasn't. The strange noises. It was mid-October when the peace broke. One night, just as Amos was drifting off, a noise outside jolted him awake. A soft, rhythmic tapping came from somewhere near the barn. He rolled over, grumbling. Probably the wind knocking a loose piece of wood against the wall, he thought. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. Amos swung his legs out of bed, pulled on his boots, and grabbed the flashlight from his nightstand. He stepped out into the cold night air, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The barn loomed in the distance, its silhouette barely visible under the thin crescent moon. As he approached, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was unnerving. He swept the light across the barn door, then around the yard. Nothing. With a shrug, Amos turned back toward the house. That's when he heard it, a low, rumbling growl from inside the barn. The discovery, Amos froze. His hand instinctively tightened around the flashlight. He hadn't kept animals in the barn for years, not since his last horse had died. Taking slow, cautious steps, he approached the door and pulled it open. The flashlight revealed a scene that made his stomach lurch. The hay bales in the corner had been shredded, scattered like confetti. Deep claw marks marred the wooden walls, and in the center of the barn floor was a puddle of dark liquid. Amos knelt to inspect it, his heart racing. Blood. But there was no sign of what caused it. The tracks. The next morning, Amos searched the property for clues. Near the barn, he found tracks pressed into the soft soil. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen. Too large for a dog, too deep for a deer, and oddly misshapen. The prints led from the barn to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared into the dense undergrowth. Coyotes, Amos muttered to himself, though he didn't believe it. Something about the tracks about the barn didn't sit right. That night, he set out traps around the property and kept his shotgun close. The visitor. For a few nights, everything seemed normal. Amos thought the disturbance might have been a fluke, but on the fifth night, it came back. He was jolted awake by the sound of something scraping against the farmhouse walls. It was slow, deliberate, as though whatever was outside wanted him to know it was there. Amos grabbed his shotgun and crept to the window. In the dim light of the porch lamp, he saw a figure move across the yard. It was hunched, its limbs too long and thin, its movements unnatural. Amos couldn't make out its face, but the sight of its shadow alone made his skin crawl. He flung open the door, aiming the shotgun at the yard. "Get off my land!" he yelled. The figure turned its head toward him. For a moment it stood still, then bolted toward the woods, disappearing into the trees. The hunt the next day, Amos was determined to end it. He tracked the creature into the woods, following broken branches and trampled grass. The deeper he went, the darker the forest grew. The trees were so thick they blocked out the sun, and an eerie silence hung in the air. At last, he found a clearing. In the center was a large rock, its surface stained dark red. Scattered around it were animal bones, some of them fresh. Amos felt the hairs on his neck rise. He wasn't alone. The confrontation, before he could react, a guttural growl echoed from the trees. The creature emerged from the shadows, stepping into the clearing. It was taller than he'd imagined, its grey skin stretched tight over a gaunt frame. Its eyes were small but sharp, reflecting the faint light like tiny mirrors. Amos raised the shotgun and fired. The blast echoed through the forest, but the creature darted away, faster than anything he'd ever seen. It circled him, moving in and out of the shadows, taunting him. Amos fired again, and this time the creature let out a high-pitched screech. But it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged. Amos swung the shotgun like a club, striking the creature as it came at him. The blow sent it staggering, but it quickly regained its footing. Amos backed away, reloading as fast as his trembling hands allowed. He fired once more, hitting it square in the chest. The creature let out a final guttural cry before collapsing. The aftermath. When the creature fell silent, Amos approached cautiously. Its body was unlike anything he'd ever seen, twisted and wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. He didn't wait to study it. He dragged the body back to the farm, dumping it into the old well behind the barn. Out of sight, out of mind. In the weeks that followed, the farm was quiet. Whatever the creature had been, it was gone now. Amos didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe him? He buried the memory with the body, returning to his quiet, predictable life. But sometimes, late at night, he thought he heard something, a faint scratching at the walls, a whisper on the wind, and he wondered if the woods were as empty as they seemed. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech and lunged. Elijah fired again, the blast knocking it back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it stood, tilting its head as if studying him. "Get off my land!" Elijah roared, firing a third time. This time, the creature stumbled and retreated into the darkness, disappearing into the cornfield. The aftermath. When morning came, Elijah ventured outside. The trail of blood led into the woods but stopped abruptly, as if the creature had vanished into thin air. The pile of bones in the clearing was gone too, leaving only a blackened patch of earth. The farm was quiet after that. No more rustling in the corn, no more missing livestock. Elijah repaired the coop and brought in new animals, but he never felt truly at ease. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind sent his heart racing. And on some nights, when the moon was high and the wind was still, he thought he could hear it, the faint sound of something scratching at the edges of his land, waiting for the right moment to return. This story delivers atmospheric suspense and straightforward horror, with no deeper subtext, just a chilling tale about a lone farmer's fight against an unknown, relentless intruder. Perfect for readers seeking classic spine-tingling thrills. For 50 years, Elijah Grayson lived and worked on his farm. It was a modest patch of land, bordered by rolling fields and dense woods. The nearest town was a good 20 miles away, and Elijah liked it that way. Solitude was his companion, and the rhythms of the seasons were all he needed. The old farmhouse creaked with age, the barn leaned slightly to the left, and the windmill out back had stopped turning years ago. Still, Elijah didn't mind. He had his animals, his crops, and the steady hum of the natural world. But by the time autumn rolled in, something felt off. The rustling in the corn. It started with sounds. Late at night, when Elijah was drifting off to sleep, he'd hear faint rustling in the cornfields. At first, he thought it was the wind or maybe a stray deer, but the noises grew louder, more deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving through the stalks. One night, curiosity got the better of him. Grabbing his lantern and his old shotgun, Elijah ventured out into the crisp autumn air. The moon cast a pale glow over the fields as he walked toward the sound. The corn swayed gently, even though the wind had stopped. "Who's there?" he called, his voice steady but firm. There was no reply, only the rustling. It came closer, then stopped. Elijah swung the lantern's light across the rows of corn, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no animals, just an eerie, suffocating silence. The vanishing livestock. The next morning, Elijah went to feed his chickens and found the coop empty. Feathers littered the ground, and the wire fence was torn open. He checked the barn and found one of his goats missing too. The door was still latched, and there were no tracks leading away from the barn. "That's strange," he muttered, scratching his beard. He searched the property but found nothing. No blood, no fur, just a growing sense of unease. Over the next week, more animals disappeared. His pigs vanished one by one, and even his old milk cow was gone without a trace. Each night he locked the barn tighter, but it made no difference. Whatever was taking his animals didn't seem to care about locks. The figure in the field. One evening, Elijah was sitting on his porch, his shotgun resting on his lap. The sun was setting, painting the fields in hues of orange and gold. As the shadows lengthened, he saw something move at the edge of the woods. At first, he thought it was a deer, but as it stepped closer, he realized it wasn't any animal he recognized. The figure was tall and gaunt, with long, thin limbs that seemed to sway unnaturally as it moved. Its head was tilted slightly, and its dark, hollow eyes seemed to be staring directly at him. Elijah stood, gripping the shotgun tightly. "You better get off my land," he shouted. The figure paused, its head cocking to the side. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the cornfield. The trail of bones. The following day, Elijah decided he'd had enough. He was going to find out what was happening on his farm. With his shotgun slung over his shoulder, he walked to the edge of the cornfield where the figure had disappeared. What he found made his stomach churn. There, hidden among the stalks, was a small clearing. In the center was a pile of bones, animal bones, scattered haphazardly, some of them still fresh. Flies buzzed around the scene and the air reeked of decay. Elijah backed away, his heart pounding. Whatever was on his land wasn't just taking his animals, it was killing them, and it was doing it close. The night visitor. That night, Elijah barricaded himself in the house. He locked every door and window, shoved furniture against the front door, and kept his shotgun loaded and within arm's reach. The lantern burned low as he sat in the dark, listening. Around midnight it started. The rustling in the corn, louder than ever, followed by heavy footsteps. They circled the house, slow and deliberate. Then came the scratching, long clawing sounds against the walls, like something was testing the strength of the wood. Elijah's breath came in short gasps. He gripped the shotgun, sweat dripping from his brow. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl just outside the kitchen window. The lantern flickered. The air felt thick and heavy. Elijah aimed the shotgun at the door, his finger hovering over the trigger. Then came the knock, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. The final stand. Elijah's heart raced as he moved toward the door. "I don't know what you are," he said, his voice trembling but determined, "but you've messed with the wrong man." The knock came again, shaking the door in its frame. Taking a deep breath, Elijah flung the door open and fired. The shotgun blast lit up the night, revealing the creature standing just feet away. It was worse than he'd imagined. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame, and its face was featureless, save for those hollow black eyes. Samuel Tate had spent his entire life on his family's farm. Tucked away in a remote corner of Kansas, it was the only home he had ever known. The house, built by his grandfather's hands, stood as a testament to years of hard work. The barn, leaning slightly to one side, carried the scars of decades of storms and neglect. Samuel didn't mind the solitude. He preferred the quiet. But the quiet was changing. The uneasy silence. In mid-October, Samuel noticed something strange. The usual hum of the farm, the chirping of crickets, the distant calls of coyotes, had vanished. The nights were eerily silent, as if the world were holding its breath. At first, he thought it was just the shifting seasons, the lull before winter set in. But the silence grew heavier, pressing against him like a weight. One night, as he lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, he heard it, a faint thumping sound coming from the barn. It was rhythmic, deliberate, not like the erratic clatter of loose wood in the wind. Probably just the old barn settling, Samuel muttered to himself. But he knew better. The first sign, the next morning, Samuel went to the barn to investigate. The animals seemed nervous, huddled in the corners of their pens. His old sheepdog, Rusty, wouldn't go near the door, growling softly with his hackles raised. Inside, nothing seemed amiss at first. But as Samuel walked the length of the barn, he noticed something strange on the far wall. Deep gouges, as if made by claws, marred the wood. They weren't there the day before. Samuel frowned, running his fingers over the marks. They were too high to be from a coyote or a stray dog. He shook his head and decided to patch them up, blaming it on some animal he hadn't yet seen. That night, the thumping returned. The cornfield. The sound moved closer over the next few nights, shifting from the barn to the fields. Samuel stood on his porch one evening, staring into the tall stalks of corn swaying in the breeze. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally far. As darkness fell, Samuel thought he saw movement, something darting between the rows. It was too big to be a raccoon or a fox, but it moved too quickly for him to get a good look. He tightened his grip on the shotgun resting against his hip. "Whatever you are, stay off my land," he muttered, his voice swallowed by the vast silence of the fields. the missing livestock. The following morning, Samuel found one of his cows dead. The animal lay sprawled in the pasture, its throat torn open. Flies buzzed around the wound and the ground beneath it was soaked with blood. Samuel had seen predators take down livestock before, but this was different. The kill was clean, too clean. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading to or from the body. It was as if the cow had simply collapsed where it stood. He dragged the carcass to the edge of the woods and buried it, the shovel biting into the hard earth as his unease grew. Whatever was out there, it wasn't normal. The shadow the next night, Samuel sat on his porch, his shotgun resting across his lap. The moon was full, casting a pale light over the fields. Rusty lay at his feet, his ears perked and his body tense. It started with the rustling again, faint at first, then growing louder. Samuel squinted into the darkness, his finger hovering over the trigger. Then he saw it. A figure emerged from the cornfield, moving with jerky, unnatural motions. It was tall, taller than any man Samuel had ever seen, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head tilted as it stepped into the moonlight, revealing hollow, sunken eyes that glowed faintly. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. He raised the shotgun, aiming at the thing's chest. "Get off my land," he shouted, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, staring at him with those empty eyes. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared back into the corn, the hunt. The next morning, Samuel decided to put an end to whatever was stalking his farm. He followed the creature's trail into the cornfield, his shotgun at the ready. The stalks closed in around him, the air thick and oppressive. The trail led to a clearing in the middle of the field. In the center was a strange circle, the ground scorched black and the corn flattened as if something heavy had pressed it down. Samuel crouched to examine it, his unease growing. The edges of the circle were marked with deep grooves like claw marks dug into the soil. Rusty barked behind him, the sound sharp and frantic. Samuel spun around just in time to see the creature emerging from the stalks. It moved quickly, its long limbs carrying it with unnatural grace. Samuel fired. The fight. The blast echoed through the field and the creature let out an unearthly screech. It staggered back but didn't fall. Samuel pumped another round into the shotgun and fired again, the recoil jolting his shoulder. This time the creature lunged. Samuel barely had time to react as it closed the distance between them. Its claws raked across his arm, tearing through his shirt and drawing blood. He stumbled backward, tripping over the uneven ground. The shotgun fell from his hands. Rusty leapt at the creature, barking and snarling, but it swatted the dog away with terrifying strength. Samuel scrambled for the shotgun, his fingers closing around the barrel just as the creature loomed over him. He fired one last time, the shot hitting the creature square in the chest. The thing let out a final guttural screech before collapsing. It twitched once, twice, then lay still. The aftermath. Samuel dragged the creature's body to the edge of the woods and buried it beside the cow. The hole was deep, the work exhausting, but he didn't stop until the thing was completely covered. Afterward, the farm was quiet again. The rustling in the cornfield ceased, and the livestock stopped disappearing. Samuel went back to his routines, but the memory of those hollow eyes lingered. Sometimes, late at night, he thought he heard the faint sound of claws scraping against wood, but he told himself it was just his imagination. Still, he kept the shotgun close, just in case. The voice fell silent, and for a moment the field was still. Then, a shadowy figure emerged from the rows of corn. It towered over Samuel, its form barely human. Its eyes glowed crimson, and its outstretched hand ended in claws. "A trade," it said, "your life for his." Samuel hesitated, his mind racing. He had nothing left but the farm, and even that had become a prison. If it meant saving Jacob, he was willing to pay the price. "I'll do it," he whispered. The creature smiled, its teeth sharp and gleaming. The harvest begins. The final night. The deal was struck. That night, the farm came alive with unnatural energy. The cornfields rustled violently, though there was no wind. Shadows danced along the edges of the property, and the whispers turned into chants, growing louder and more insistent. Samuel sat on the porch, shotgun in hand, waiting. Just before midnight, he saw him, Jacob, walking up the gravel path, his hat pulled low over his face. "Jacob?" Samuel called out, tears streaming down his cheeks. But as Jacob drew closer, Samuel saw that something was wrong. His son's eyes were blank, his movements stiff and unnatural. Behind him, the shadowy figure loomed, its smile wide and cruel. The harvest. The next morning, Crow Hollow Farm was silent. The farmhouse stood empty, its windows dark. The fields were untouched, but something felt off. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the land itself mourned. Locals say that on certain nights when the moon is full, you can still hear Samuel's voice calling for his son. And if you stand at the edge of the field too long, you might see him, a scarecrow standing in the middle of the corn, its painted smile crooked and its eyes hollow. They say the land claimed him, just as it claimed Jacob. And Crow Hollow Farm remains cursed, its fields forever hungry for more. Crow Hollow Farm had been Samuel Dyer's entire world for 50 years. The land stretched endlessly, the horizon only broken by rows of corn swaying in the wind. Once the farm had been alive with laughter. His wife Clara and their son Jacob had made the loneliness of rural life bearable. But those days were long gone. Clara had died of a sudden illness, and Jacob had disappeared one stormy night 20 years ago, leaving Samuel alone with his grief. Now at 67, Samuel spent his days tending the land and his nights battling the memories that haunted the creaking old farmhouse. But as autumn crept in, something else began to haunt Crow Hollow. Something Samuel couldn't explain. A presence in the corn. It started with whispers. Late at night, Samuel would sit on his porch, staring out over the fields, a glass of whiskey in hand. The wind would pick up, rustling the corn, and he could have sworn he heard faint voices carried on the breeze. They were low and guttural, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. One night, he ventured into the field to investigate. The rows of corn closed around him, the stalks swaying unnaturally despite the stillness of the air. As he moved deeper, the whispers grew louder, forming a strange, rhythmic chant. Then he saw it, a shadow darting between the stalks, too tall and too thin to be human. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. No answer came. Samuel turned and ran, the feeling of unseen eyes boring into his back. Signs in the soil. The next morning, Samuel ventured back into the field, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. He found nothing unusual at first, just the familiar rows of corn. But when he reached the center of the field, he froze. Burned into the soil was a circle, perfectly symmetrical and blackened as if by fire. Around its edges were strange symbols scratched deep into the earth. Samuel's stomach churned as he realized they looked almost like writing. He tried to brush it off as the work of vandals, teenagers maybe, but deep down he knew better. Crow Hollow was too isolated, miles from the nearest town. No one ever came this far. The scarecrow a week later, Samuel decided to install a new scarecrow. The old one had been a staple of the farm for decades, but its straw body had rotted, and its head, an old burlap sack, was disintegrating. He built a new one using what materials he had: a wooden frame, fresh hay for stuffing, and a canvas sack for the head. He even painted a crude face on it, 2 black eyes and a jagged smile. The scarecrow stood tall in the middle of the field, its arms outstretched as if in silent greeting. Samuel felt a strange sense of unease as he hammered it into place, but he shook it off. That night, he woke to the sound of something tapping against his bedroom window. He sat up, his heart pounding. The sound came again, sharp and deliberate. Slowly he crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The scarecrow was no longer in the field. It stood directly beneath his window, its painted smile tilted slightly upward as if watching him. Samuel stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. When he gathered the courage to look again, the scarecrow was gone. The return of Jacob. The next day, Samuel found himself drawn to the field despite his mounting fear. As he approached, he saw the scarecrow back in its original place. He considered tearing it down, but stopped when he noticed something strange. The scarecrow was wearing Jacob's old hat. Samuel's blood ran cold. He hadn't seen that hat in 20 years, since the night Jacob vanished. He searched the house for answers, tearing through drawers and closets, but the hat was nowhere to be found. That night, The whispers returned, louder than ever. This time they seemed to be coming from the house itself. Samuel followed the sound to the kitchen, where he found the back door wide open. He hadn't touched that door in days. On the kitchen table lay a photograph of his family, one he hadn't seen in years. In it, Jacob stood in front of the field, smiling, his hat tilted at an angle. But now, the photograph was different. The rows of corn behind Jacob were blackened, and a shadow loomed over him, a tall, thin figure with glowing red eyes. The bargain. By now, Samuel knew he wasn't alone. Something had claimed Crow Hollow. Desperate for answers, he ventured back to the burned circle in the field. "Who are you?" he shouted into the darkness. "What do you want?" The wind picked up, swirling around him. The corn seemed to close in, the stalks leaning toward him like skeletal fingers. Then a voice, deep and resonant, filled the air. "Your son." Samuel's heart clenched. "What about him?" he cried. "Where is he?" The voice laughed, low and menacing. "Jacob is ours. He belongs to the field now." "No," Samuel screamed. "Take me instead. Just give him back." Crow Hollow Farm had been Samuel Dyer's entire world for 50 years. The land stretched endlessly, the horizon only broken by rows of corn swaying in the wind. Once the farm had been alive with laughter. His wife, Clara, and their son, Jacob, had made the loneliness of rural life bearable. But those days were long gone. Clara had died of a sudden illness, and Jacob had disappeared one stormy night 20 years ago, leaving Samuel alone with his grief. Now at 67, Samuel spent his days tending the land and his nights battling the memories that haunted the creaking old farmhouse. But as autumn crept in, something else began to haunt Crow Hollow. Something Samuel couldn't explain. A presence in the corn. It started with whispers. Late at night, Samuel would sit on his porch, staring out over the fields, a glass of whiskey in hand. The wind would pick up, rustling the corn, and he could have sworn he heard faint voices carried on the breeze. They were low and guttural, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. One night, he ventured into the field to investigate. The rows of corn closed around him, the stalks swaying unnaturally despite the stillness of the air. As he moved deeper, the whispers grew louder, forming a strange, rhythmic chant. Then he saw it, a shadow darting between the stalks, too tall and too thin to be human. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice trembling. No answer came. Samuel turned and ran, a feeling of unseen eyes boring into his back. Signs in the soil. The next morning, Samuel ventured back into the field, his shotgun slung over his shoulder. He found nothing unusual at first, just the familiar rows of corn. But when he reached the center of the field, he froze. Burned into the soil was a circle, perfectly symmetrical and blackened as if by fire. Around its edges were strange symbols scratched deep into the earth. Samuel's stomach churned as he realized they looked almost like writing. He tried to brush it off as the work of vandals, teenagers maybe, but deep down he knew better. Crow Hollow was too isolated, miles from the nearest town. No one ever came this far. The scarecrow a week later, Samuel decided to install a new scarecrow. The old one had been a staple of the farm for decades, but its straw body had rotted, and its head, an old burlap sack, was disintegrating. He built a new one using what materials he had: a wooden frame, fresh hay for stuffing, and a canvas sack for the head. He even painted a crude face on it, 2 black eyes and a jagged smile. The scarecrow stood tall in the middle of the field, its arms outstretched as if in silent greeting. Samuel felt a strange sense of unease as he hammered it into place, but he shook it off. That night, he woke to the sound of something tapping against his bedroom window. He sat up, his heart pounding. The sound came again, sharp and deliberate. Slowly, he crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. The scarecrow was no longer in the field. It stood directly beneath his window, its painted smile tilted slightly upward as if watching him. Samuel stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat. When he gathered the courage to look again, the scarecrow was gone. The return of Jacob. The next day, Samuel found himself drawn to the field despite his mounting fear. As he approached, he saw the scarecrow back in its original place. He considered tearing it down, but stopped when he noticed something strange. The scarecrow was wearing Jacob's old hat, Samuel's blood ran cold. He hadn't seen that hat in 20 years, since the night Jacob vanished. He searched the house for answers, tearing through drawers and closets, but the hat was nowhere to be found. That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. This time they seemed to be coming from the house itself. Samuel followed the sound to the kitchen, where he found the back door wide open. He hadn't touched that door in days. On the kitchen table lay a photograph of his family, one he hadn't seen in years. In it, Jacob stood in front of the field, smiling, his hat tilted at an angle. But now, the photograph was different. The rows of corn behind Jacob were blackened, and a shadow loomed over him, a tall, thin figure with glowing red eyes. The bargain. By now, Samuel knew he wasn't alone. Something had claimed Crow Hollow. Desperate for answers, he ventured back to the burned circle in the field. "Who are you?" he shouted into the darkness. "What do you want?" The wind picked up, swirling around him. The corn seemed to close in, the stalks leaning toward him like skeletal fingers. Then a voice, deep and resonant, filled the air. "Your son." Samuel's heart clenched. "What about him?" he cried. "Where is he?" The voice laughed, low and menacing. "Jacob is ours. He belongs to the field now." "No!" Samuel screamed. "Take me instead. Just give him back." The voice fell silent, and for a moment the field was still. Then a shadowy figure emerged from the rows of corn. It towered over Samuel, its form barely human. Its eyes glowed crimson, and its outstretched hand ended in claws. "A trade," it said. "Your life for his." Samuel hesitated, his mind racing. He had nothing left but the farm, and even that had become a prison. If it meant saving Jacob, he was willing to pay the price. "I'll do it," he whispered. The creature smiled, its teeth sharp and gleaming. The harvest begins. The final night. The deal was struck. That night, the farm came alive with unnatural energy. The cornfields rustled violently, though there was no wind. Shadows danced along the edges of the property, and the whispers turned into chants, growing louder and more insistent. Samuel sat on the porch, shotgun in hand, waiting. Just before midnight, he saw him, Jacob, walking up the gravel path, his hat pulled low over his face. "Jacob?" Samuel called out, tears streaming down his cheeks. But as Jacob drew closer, Samuel saw that something was wrong. His son's eyes were blank, his movements stiff and unnatural. Behind him, the shadowy figure loomed, its smile wide and cruel. The harvest. The next morning, Crow Hollow Farm was silent. The farmhouse stood empty, its windows dark. The fields were untouched, but something felt off. The air was heavy, oppressive, as if the land itself mourned. Locals say that on certain nights when the moon is full, you can still hear Samuel's voice calling for his son. And if you stand at the edge of the field too long, you might see him, a scarecrow standing in the middle of the corn, its painted smile crooked and its eyes hollow. They say the land claimed him, just as it claimed Jacob. And Crow Hollow Farm remains cursed, its fields forever hungry for more. Deep in the rolling hills of Kansas, an aging farmer named Emmett Calloway tended to his land. He was a solitary man, not by choice but by circumstance. His wife had passed 10 years earlier, and his son had left for the city long before that, never to return. The farm, once a bustling family haven, now stood eerily quiet, the only sound the creak of weathered wood and the rustling of dry cornstalks. The harvest season was late this year, and Emmett worked tirelessly to prepare for it. Nights came early, cloaking the fields in a heavy, suffocating darkness. But he didn't mind. The farm was his life. The land, he always said, spoke to him. But this year, the whispers had turned into something else, something darker. The first sign, it began subtly. While ploughing one evening, his tractor's engine sputtered and died in the middle of the field. Frustrated, Emmett climbed down and popped the hood. As he fumbled with a wrench, a strange sensation crept over him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he felt as though unseen eyes were watching him from the wall of corn just a few yards away. "Who's there?" he barked, spinning around, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The rows of corn stood silent, swaying gently in the breeze. Emmett chalked it up to his imagination and returned to his task. But as he worked, A low, guttural sound echoed faintly from the field. It wasn't the wind, nor an animal. It was something else entirely. A voice? No, a growl. He froze, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Shaking off the unease, he walked back to the house, feeling the weight of something unseen pressing against his back the entire way. The unseen harvesters. As the days passed, strange things began happening around the farm. Tools disappeared, only to reappear in places Emmett would never leave them. His barn door, always latched securely, would swing open in the dead of night. The livestock grew restless, their eyes wide and wild, as if sensing danger. Then, one morning, he found his scarecrow lying in the middle of the field. Its head, a burlap sack stuffed with straw, was torn open, its button eyes scattered on the ground like seeds. The wooden cross it had hung from was cracked as though ripped apart by tremendous force. This wasn't the work of animals. Determined to put an end to the disturbances, Emmett decided to set up cameras around the farm. That night, he sat in his kitchen, sipping coffee and watching the monitor. The black and white screen showed static images of his fields, his barn, and the long gravel driveway leading to his house. For hours, nothing happened. The clock ticked past midnight, and Emmett's eyelids grew heavy. Just as he was about to doze off, movement on the screen jolted him awake. One of the cameras showed the cornfield swaying violently, though there was no wind. Shapes, tall, spindly figures, emerged from the stalks. Their limbs were unnaturally long, their heads misshapen and angular. They moved with a jerking, unnatural gait, as though unused to their bodies. Emmett's heart pounded as he watched the figures creep closer to the house. One by one, they turned their heads toward the camera. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. The night of shadows. Grabbing his shotgun, Emmett bolted the doors and turned off all the lights. He crouched in the living room, peering through the curtains. Outside, the night was black as ink, save for the faint glow of the moon. Then he heard it, the creak of the porch steps. Something was out there, pacing back and forth. The sound of claws scraping against wood sent shivers down his spine. "Get off my property!" he shouted, his voice trembling. He fired a warning shot into the air, the blast echoing across the empty fields. The pacing stopped. Silence fell, so complete that Emmett could hear his own ragged breathing. Then a low, guttural laugh rumbled from the other side of the door. It wasn't human. It was deep and resonant, like the growl of a predator. The doorknob began to turn, the final confrontation. Before the door could open, Emmett fired through it, the buckshot splintering wood. A deafening screech followed, more animal than man. Something heavy thudded against the porch, then all was quiet. Emmett didn't sleep that night. When dawn finally broke, he ventured outside, shotgun in hand. The porch was empty, save for deep gouges in the wood and a trail of black, tar-like substance leading back to the cornfield. Driven by a mix of fear and fury, Emmett followed the trail into the stalks. The corn towered above him, the dense rows swallowing the sunlight. The further he went, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing against his chest. At the center of the field, he found a clearing. The ground was scorched black, and in the middle stood a circle of wooden effigies, grotesque and twisted. They resembled his scarecrow, but were far more sinister. Tied to each one were scraps of his belongings, his hat, a broken wrench, the collar of his old dog. In the center of the circle was a hole deep and dark, as if the earth itself had been ripped open. The black substance seeped from it, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. Before he could react, the ground beneath him trembled. A figure rose from the hole, taller and more monstrous than the ones he'd seen on the camera. Its eyes burned like fire, and its limbs ended in claws that gleamed in the dim light. "You've worked this land long enough," it rasped, its voice like gravel. "Now it belongs to us." The harvest claims. Its own Emmett fired at the creature, but the bullets had no effect. It lunged at him, its claws tearing through his shirt, raking across his chest. Pain seared through him as he fell to the ground. He scrambled to his feet and ran, his heart pounding as he tore through the corn. The stalks seemed to close in around him, slowing his escape. Behind him, the sound of heavy, labored breathing grew closer. When he finally burst out of the field and into the open, the sun was setting. He stumbled back to the house, bloodied and shaken. Locking the doors, he realized the fight wasn't over. The creatures wouldn't stop until they'd claimed everything. That night, Emmett sat in his living room, the shotgun across his lap, waiting. But the creatures didn't come. The night passed in silence, but it wasn't a comforting one. It was the silence of something waiting. The farm stand's silent days turned to weeks. Emmett didn't leave the house. The farm outside withered, the crops dying unnaturally fast. The livestock vanished, their pens left open. The once thriving land became barren, cursed. Months later, the local sheriff arrived to check on the old farmer. The house was empty, the windows shattered, and the walls scratched with strange symbols. The fields were overgrown, the corn blackened and brittle. Emmett Calloway was never seen again, but the locals swear on moonless nights you can still hear the laughter, low, guttural and inhuman, coming from the fields. And if you look too long into the rows of corn, you might see them, the watchers, waiting for their next harvest. Samuel Harris had spent his whole life on the farm. His grandfather had built the farmhouse with rough-hewn stone, and his father had spent years cultivating the land. Now, in his late 50s, Samuel was the last of the Harris family to work the land. The small farm, tucked away in the rolling hills of central Kentucky, had been quiet for years, save for the occasional neighbor who stopped by to trade supplies. But Samuel liked it that way, peaceful, calm, and above all, isolated. The fields were vast, and the woods that bordered them stretched for miles, growing thicker and darker as they reached the horizon. Samuel had always found comfort in the quiet, but something had changed in the past few months. The nights had become unnervingly still, as if the world around him had stopped breathing. A change in the wind, it started with the wind. It was odd, Samuel thought, how it would pick up in the middle of the night, only to drop away to nothing. He could feel it in his bones, like a warning that something was approaching. He would sit on the porch, chewing on his tobacco and staring out into the fields. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him. The first sign of trouble came in the form of his livestock. One morning, Samuel went to check on his chickens and found that half of them were missing. The coop had been torn open, the wire fencing shredded as though something large had forced its way inside. Feathers were scattered everywhere, and the ground was churned up with tracks that didn't resemble any animal he knew. Samuel figured it was coyotes or maybe even a wild dog. It wasn't the first time something had attacked his flock. That night, he stayed up later than usual, watching the shadows stretch across the fields. He had a rifle by his side, loaded and ready. Rusty, his old farm dog, lay by the door, his ears twitching every time the wind howled through the trees. Samuel had never been one to get easily rattled, but something about that night felt off. The howl. Just after midnight, the howl came. It was unlike anything Samuel had ever heard. It started low and distant, like a wolf's cry, but much deeper. A sound that seemed to crawl under his skin and freeze his blood. It sent Rusty barking into the night, his growls low and ominous. Samuel grabbed his rifle and went out onto the porch, squinting into the dark. The howl came again, this time closer. It sent a shiver down Samuel's spine, but he kept his grip steady on the rifle. He couldn't afford to let his mind wander. Whatever it was, he had to protect his farm. He took a step toward the barn, his boots crunching in the dry grass. Rusty followed, his body tense, his eyes darting to and fro. The howl sounded again, sharper now, coming from the direction of the woods. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. Something was out there. The missing cow. The next day, Samuel went out to check on his herd of cows. There was one missing, a large black and white cow named Molly that had been with him for years. He searched the field and the woods around the farm, but found nothing. No tracks, no blood, no signs of struggle. Just an eerie emptiness where Molly had once grazed. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Samuel stood on the porch, scanning the darkness. The wind picked up again, and this time it carried with it a faint, rancid smell. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. The howl came again, closer still. "Damn it," Samuel muttered under his breath, clutching the rifle tighter. He couldn't just sit by and let whatever it was pick off his livestock. He grabbed a lantern, strapped a flashlight to his belt, and set out into the woods. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the answer lay somewhere in the trees. The tracks, deep in the woods, Samuel found something that made his blood run cold. At first, it looked like the tracks of a large animal, maybe a bear or a wolf. But as he followed the trail, it became clear that this was something else entirely. The tracks were uneven, with long, deep scratches in the earth as if something had dragged itself along the ground. The prints were huge, nearly the size of a man's foot, but with claws that could tear through stone. Samuel's stomach twisted. He had no idea what could have made these marks, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a wolf. He turned and walked back toward the farm, his mind racing with possibilities. Whatever it was getting closer. The midnight visitor. That night, the howl was joined by something else, scratching. The same sound he'd heard before, but this time it was closer, much closer. Samuel's heart raced as he grabbed the rifle and crept toward the window. Outside, in the pale light of the moon, he saw it. A tall, thin figure was standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the light of the porch. Its body was hunched, its head bent at an unnatural angle. Its eyes were large, glimmering in the darkness like twin pools of black water, and the thing was scratching at the wooden walls of the barn. Samuel's breath caught in his throat. His first instinct was to run, but something held him in place. He couldn't look away. The thing was dragging its claws along the barn, leaving deep gouges in the wood, and it seemed to be searching for something. The scratching continued, rhythmic and steady, as if the creature was deliberately tormenting him. The confrontation. With a slow, deliberate movement, Samuel pushed open the door and stepped outside, keeping low to the ground. Rusty stood at his side, growling, his hackles raised. The creature turned its head toward them, its eyes glinting with a cold, malevolent intelligence. Samuel raised his rifle and took aim. The creature didn't move. It just stared at him, its head tilting slightly as if it were studying him. Then, with a sudden, jerky motion, it lunged toward him. The shot rang out, echoing through the trees. The creature screamed, a high-pitched, unnatural sound, and stumbled backward. It wasn't dead, though. It was still moving, dragging itself towards Samuel with a horrible, unnatural speed. Its claws scraped against the ground, leaving long trails of dirt behind it. Samuel didn't hesitate. He fired again, this time hitting the creature in the chest. It collapsed, twitching and spasming, its body writhing as if it were trying to escape. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it went still. Samuel stood over it, panting, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what it was, but he knew one thing. It was gone. The aftermath. The next morning, Samuel stood by the barn, looking at the dead creature. It wasn't the thing he had imagined. Its skin was dark and mottled like rotting leather. Its long, spindly limbs were covered in patches of hair that looked more like matted fur. Its eyes were wide open, unblinking, even in death. He buried it in a shallow grave at the edge of the woods, but the memory of it stayed with him. As the days passed, the strange happenings ceased. The howl was gone, the scratching stopped, and Samuel's livestock were no longer taken. But every night, when he stood on his porch, looking out into the dark, he could feel its presence watching him from just beyond the trees. And sometimes, in the dead of night, he thought he could still hear that terrible howl, echoing from deep within the woods. For as long as he could remember, old farmer Eli Turner had lived a quiet life on Hollow Ridge Farm. It wasn't much, just a small house, a weathered barn, and a few dozen acres of pasture bordered by dense woods. His days were spent tending to his livestock, fixing fences and sitting on his creaky porch, listening to the hum of cicadas as the sun set. He liked the solitude, but solitude has a way of turning sour when something unknown comes creeping in. It started on a brisk October night when Eli awoke to the sound of frantic bleating. His heart jumped, and he instinctively reached for the shotgun that leaned against his nightstand. Something was in the goat pen. The first encounter. Eli threw on his boots, grabbed a flashlight, and headed out into the chilly darkness. The beams of light from the farmhouse and barn barely reached the pen, leaving much of the farm cloaked in shadows. As he approached, the bleating grew louder, more desperate. Probably just a coyote, he muttered under his breath, though the thought didn't sit right. Coyotes usually worked in packs, and he hadn't seen one near Hollow Ridge in years. He raised the flashlight and froze. Something was hunched over one of the goats, its outline sharp and angular, as though its body had too many joints. Its skin was mottled and grey, stretched taut over a skeletal frame. Eli could make out the faint gleam of its eyes, red and unblinking, reflecting the flashlight's beam. The creature's maw dripped with something dark as it tore into the goat's neck. "Hey!" Eli shouted, cocking the shotgun. The creature snapped its head toward him. For a moment, the two stared at each other. Then, with an unnatural speed, it bounded over the fence and disappeared into the woods, leaving behind the lifeless body of Eli's goat. Shaken, Eli inspected the carcass. The wounds weren't like anything he'd seen before. The goat's neck had 2 puncture marks, and its body was completely drained of blood. Tracks and signs. The following morning, Eli scoured the area for tracks. The ground was soft from a recent rain, and he found them easily. Long, clawed prints that didn't match any animal he knew. They led from the goat pen to the woods, where they abruptly stopped as if the creature had taken flight. Determined to protect his livestock, Eli reinforced the fences and set up traps around the perimeter of the farm. He even called the county animal control office, but they laughed him off when he described the creature. "You've got yourself a chupacabra," one of the deputies joked. Eli didn't laugh. The Night Stalker. Over the next few nights, the attacks continued. Each time, it was the same. Eli would wake to the sounds of his animals panicking, rush outside with his shotgun, and find another lifeless body. Chickens, goats, even one of his prized cows. Each kill was more vicious than the last, and each time the creature escaped before Eli could get a clean shot. The sightings were fleeting, but the creature's image was burned into Eli's mind. It walked on 2 legs but moved like an animal, its long limbs bending in unnatural ways. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its breath came out in low, raspy growls. On the 4th night, Eli decided to stay up, determined to confront the beast. He sat in the barn with his shotgun loaded, a lantern casting dim light across the hay-strewn floor. Midnight came and went, and the farm was eerily quiet. But just as he began to doze off, he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the far end of the barn. Eli stood slowly, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of claws scraping against wood. Then, from the shadows, it emerged. The creature was larger than he remembered, its sinewy frame towering over him, its snarled, bearing jagged, blood-stained teeth. Without thinking, Eli fired. The blast echoed through the barn, and the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek. But it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. Eli dove out of the way, the lantern toppling and plunging the barn into darkness. He scrambled to reload, but by the time he raised the gun again, the creature was gone. The hunt, Eli couldn't take it anymore. He drove into town the next morning, telling anyone who would listen about the beast that was terrorizing his farm. Most dismissed him as a senile old man, but a few locals mentioned similar stories. Farm animals found drained of blood, sightings of a strange, shadowy figure in the woods. One man, a retired tracker named Hank, offered to help. "If it's out there," Hank said, "we'll find it." That night, armed with rifles and flashlights, the 2 men set out into the woods. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and an unnatural silence hung over the trees. As they moved deeper, they found more signs. Claw marks gouged into tree trunks, patches of ground littered with bones. Then they found the cave, the lair. The entrance was hidden behind a tangle of roots, nearly invisible in the dark. A foul stench wafted out, and the walls inside were smeared with dried blood. Bones, animal and otherwise, were piled in the corners. Eli's stomach churned as they ventured deeper, their flashlights barely cutting through the darkness. At the back of the cave, they found a makeshift nest, a pit lined with matted fur and feathers. And there, in the center, lay the remains of a young calf, its body drained like the others. Before they could retreat, the growl came again, low, rumbling, and impossibly close. The creature appeared at the mouth of the cave, blocking their exit. It stood taller than ever, its eyes burning like coals. Hank fired first, the shot grazing the creature's shoulder. It howled in pain but didn't back down. Eli fired next, hitting it square in the chest. The creature stumbled, but instead of fleeing, it lunged forward, claws slashing wildly. The fight was brutal. In the chaos, Hank was thrown against the wall, unconscious. Eli, battered and bleeding, managed one final shot. The creature let out a deafening roar before collapsing, its body twitching violently before going still. The aftermath. By morning, the authorities arrived. The creature's body had vanished, leaving behind only bloodstains and broken bones. The official explanation was a large predator, though Eli knew the truth. He sold the farm a month later, unable to bear the memories. Hollow Ridge remained abandoned, its fields overgrown and its barns slowly collapsing. Locals whispered that on moonless nights, you could still hear the growls of the beast and see its red eyes glowing in the woods. Eli moved to a small town far away, but he never truly escaped. The image of the Chupacabra haunted his dreams, a reminder that some things in the dark are better left undisturbed. And though he never returned to Hollow Ridge, Eli always kept his shotgun close, just in case.